So yes, my name is Robert Burns. I work for a local authority. I'm a director of service. It's a role that'll be familiar to people in Ireland. So I'm part of the senior management team in the Dún Laoghaire Down County Council. I manage our infrastructure programs. I do a lot of work on climate change, and I actually headed up the council's response on COVID-19 and mobility and public realm interventions just last year. We're still continuing with it. So I'm just going to look at how we might connect research, academia, public agencies, research bodies with practical implementation. Because, that's where I see a significant gap. There's lots of good ideas, but are they blending or melding with people who are actually doing this in practice? So just have an introduction, and I'll talk a little bit about my own thinking on mobility and livability, look at some of the interventions we've carried out, and look at engagement and collaboration and some final thoughts. So I suppose it's useful to give some context. Dún Laoghaire Down mightn't mean a whole lot to anyone in Scotland. Might have heard of Dún Laoghaire. So we are a county council, actually, within the County Dublin area, if you like. So you can see on the map. So we are the smallest county council in area in Ireland, but we quite a large population, 220,000. What's interesting about the county is about 1/3 of it is rural. It's largely split by the M50, which is an orbital motorway around the city. And so it's pretty rural. I mean, it's, in the mountain areas in the county. And our largest town will be about 27,000 people, is Dún Laoghaire. But just doing a check of the towns and villages and how you count a town or village is always, I suppose, up matter of debate, but we have about 36. And it's quite interesting when we look at or listen to some discussion already and to do with Ireland. Actually, I didn't see any reference to our city villages or city towns and villages, and we have a lot of them. And I guess we shouldn't forget them. And our cities in and of themselves are very important urban spaces. And it's not an amorphous sort of area. There are distinct districts or discrete areas we need to look at. So I suppose my thinking on, so I'm an engineer by profession, so I've spent a lot of time looking at transportation and mobility. When we look at that, we would think of things like safety, sustainable modes. So we're always trying to get people walking, cycling, public transport, and the private vehicle will come last. And even with all the talk of micro mobility, that isn't going to change. The scooter still comes down, probably after a person cycling. So, or shared vehicles or taxis or whatever. So the hierarchy still holds. We need to think about the environment and the economy, very much a concern at the moment with air quality, noise pollution, and so on, and our health and well-being. And this really does come in at the heart of mobility, and that's why active travel is such an important part of it. It isn't just about moving around; it's also about our physical health and our mental health. And so, when you think about that, and you look at urban spaces, I would see it as being an issue around livability. And I suppose that's really trying to ensure that our inhabitants or towns and villages have a decent life, and that we're meeting their needs. And in and of itself, the space is sustainable. And this is where I see that coming in. So you have this idea of people and space. We've all pretty much familiar with that, but the time element is sometimes forgotten. And that's what's really come to the fore with the ideas on 15-minute cities and so on, that you're actually looking at the time that it takes to move around, and that if you can move towards compact development, you reduce the need for fairly extensive mobility networks, that people can walk or cycle if they need to. And if all the the retail and services that they need are within that district, then that's to their benefit. But it's not hemming them in either. It's not a confined area. People will move outside of that. And I would sort of deliberately point to physical, social, cultural, and economic needs, and I probably would even include them in that order. And so, if we are designing urban spaces, are we doing all those things? I mean, maybe the great future for towns and villages is the cultural activities. Maybe spend more time on that. If we focus too much on the economic, we leave aside the social impact. So these are places for people to meet, to spend time, to dwell, to socialize, and obviously their physical needs. I mean, if we have extensive road networks going through our towns and villages, it's acting to sever the community, sever each side of the street even. And is that good for our physical needs? Is it easier to cross? Not. I would say it's not. And there are other issues with that. And it's about blending all of this together. And that's the approach I would take. It's the approach we've taken in Dunleary Downs, that we really need to get our mobility planning and our, I suppose, urban planning, our land use planning aligned. And in our new county development plan that's been drafted, we're actually incorporating formally the concept of the 10-minute neighbourhood. That's suited to us as a county with a necklace of towns and villages, as opposed to maybe a 15-minute city. So some of the interventions we carried out, we carried out I was made a reference earlier about COVID type interventions. I mean, the tactical urbanism, capturing the space, and we were very active on that. So we put in place a 4.5 kilometre quick build cycle route, more a mobility route. It's not just for cycling, along our coast between Blackrock and Sandycove. That's what it looks like now. We built that in about 3 months last summer. So we allocated a driving lane, and we did other things like this. And this is one of the interventions that I suppose maybe demonstrates our thinking in terms of mobility and livability. We converted that space, which was a sort of a nebulous parking area, along what would be one of the most beautiful coastal locations in Dublin. And we transformed it into that, which is a mobility route, the cycle lane, but with this pop-up space where people can rest and spend time. And, you know, it's something that I think there's a lot of appetite for as well. People actually get that. Their eyes will be drawn more to what's on the left and what's on the right for most people, but it's a sign that you can actually get both. If you try and approach it in the right way, rather than focus on cycle lanes, we're saying, well, look, we're adapting this urban space. We're making this a more livable area. It's more suited to people, older people who want to rest, or families who are out for the day. One other intervention was in Blackrock Village. So we made this village one way. We widened footpaths, we expanded the public space. We also made space available for businesses to put out their, you know, tables and chairs and have hospitality. We also were sympathetic to the heritage of the village. So the placemaking public realm, while it was temporary, we did take account of that. Now, this is a village that has been bypassed for years with 2 large shopping centres, and to a degree was suffering because of that, because a lot of the commercial activity is elsewhere. We were very lucky. We had a very engaged business and residential community, and we were able to work with them. And Blackrock has, you know, it's an urban village. You know, it has its own character. It has its own centre. It has a surrounding residential community. Another village across the county, in the west of the county, is Dundrum. We did something similar. We made that one way, widened paths. And it would be a heritage village. There's very prominent buildings, high quality architecture in there. There's the church, Holy Cross Church, and across the way is Pembroke Cottages. They will be quite well known to people who from the area or would have visited. We really had a lack of activity in the northern end of the village. There is a massive shopping centre at the south end, Dundrum Town Centre, which really has sucked the life away from the rest of the village. And so we were actually trying to bring activity back to other parts of the village, and that's what we did with expanding the space, putting out our own seating or allowing businesses to put out theirs. Plus, there's a large residential population surrounding the village, and that's another feature of COVID. With more people working from home, not needing to travel, this would largely be the commuter area for Dublin City. So most people weren't leaving, and now they were able to do things closer to home. And we've developed this model, which is we're calling an adaptive build model, and we use it for our public realm and mobility interventions. And what we're looking to do is try and bring people along with us, use a trialing approach. We put in temporary quick build measures to show how the space can be used, how it can be adapted to make it safe for people who are walking and cycling. And then we work with the community, the other stakeholders, to tweak it, improve it as it goes, or if it isn't working, to remove it or change it. So it's a plan, do, trial, review, improve model. And we look at things with a cross-departmental, multidisciplinary approach. So our architects are always talking to our engineers, we're talking to our communications, community engagement, and so on. We look at public and stakeholder engagement before, during, and after changes. Oftentimes with consultation, if you want to call it that, it happens at the start in a design and then people disappear and nobody gets to find out how it happened, how it worked during it or after it, so that you could make changes. We're very keen to have community engagement, collaboration. We're looking at ways of engaging children, older people, disability groups. So there's a new initiative with the Department of Children. It's called Hub na Nóg, which is Children's Hub, and we're working with the department on some pilot projects on that. We've also linked up with an NGO called A Playful City here in Dublin to work with them on some initiatives, but we're planning how that would go. We think there's more we could be doing in terms of engaging on public health, on air quality, noise, and physical activity, and we're working on that. So that is with state actors or concerned public health organisations. So, for example, Asthma Ireland or Irish Doctors for the Environment is another group that I've been working with. So, I suppose to get to the point of this, I suppose, webinars, we are looking at how we can have further academic engagement and move towards a more evidence-based approach, because at the moment we're seriously lacking in that evidence base, and it's in that space that a lot of people can put in, misinformation, can make mischief, or we're trying to push back on anecdotes and for example, theories on displaced traffic and how our interventions may be making things worse rather than better. And sometimes quite hard to refute it. But that's why the evidence is really important. And we need a common framework for planning and evaluation. There's plenty of different frameworks out there. There's the one that Ali has mentioned, but there's the Healthy Streets tool that's used in London, which is an excellent tool, very, very relatable for people. We're actually using that to assess our interventions with TU Dublin. And we also see that there's measure in engaging with the university programs and students on, let's say, trialing some changes, getting them involved in work that's going on in the local authorities, and it brings them into the community as well. I think that'd be really good for the students and the universities. And at the moment, we have engagement with TU Dublin, Technological University Dublin, on the COVID interventions, and TCD, Trinity, we're working with them on sustainable mobility. We're looking at different bike parking, and we're looking at a cargo bike stroke retail, digital retail platform for our villages in Dún But we think there's scope for a lot more, and I'd be really interested in obviously discussing that today and in other forums. And I guess my final thoughts are, as someone who works in a local authority, I'm not going to look at mobility on its own. I have to look at it with the public realm, and I have to look at it with my colleagues in planning who are preparing county development plans, local area plans. And so far I haven't heard much about the local authorities' role in the various things that are happening. Whether they're maybe seen as part of the solution or part of the problem, I'm not really sure. But they have a huge role, and they'll be probably the most significant partner that you will have locally. And I think it's really important to engage and get them on side. I spent a lot of time and work on active mobility networks. We're building quite an extensive active travel network in Ireland. There's about 1.8 billion earmarked to be spent for over 5 years. We in Dún Laoghaire Down alone this year have 34 million euro to spend on new active travel networks. It's a big program, and we're ramping up in terms of resources. And I think this is really interesting. The approach coming from the National Transport Agency here in Ireland is moving towards a more a process where there's more engagement. It's cross-departmental, it's multidisciplinary. So we're looking at ways for us to engage more with other government agencies, residents, businesses, elected representatives. Again, I haven't heard much talk about the engagement with elected representatives so far. That's critical, I would have thought, to be engaging with local politicians. Multidisciplinary is at the heart of what we do, and I think it really needs to be at the heart of any of these interventions. Our heritage professionals, conservation, architects, engineers, and engineers get blamed for a lot of things, and all these crazy traffic systems that we have. But we have to remember that they were at the forefront of providing safe public health for all of us and our ancestors back in the 18th century, and they built our railways, and they built our active travel network. So I think it's really important to see a place for all professionals in this area. But there are other people who aren't necessarily professional, and that's why engagement with with residents groups, with community groups is really important as well.
Robert,
I would argue that
the closing statement, please.
Yeah, and so I'd argue that it's we need to take a dynamic approach. Communicating and explaining is really important, at least to push back on false information. And I think we need to embrace modern communication tools like social media. And yes, I'd argue that we need to take an evidence-based approach and have a common framework. And I guess the final thing I'd say is, if I see that on its own, often what I hear people say to us is that worked wherever, Copenhagen, Netherlands, Edinburgh, wherever, but won't work here. And I think our job, our objective should be to change it to this. And that worked the next place and might work here. At least if we have moved the conversation to that, we're starting to move things along. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you.